Hey everybody, it's Camera Tim. I'm going to show you how to utilize color management with any type of footage you have in DaVinci Resolve and stuff. So first off, what is color management? Well, to break it down in its most simplistic form, color management is the process of taking what your camera captured and transforming it into something your display can accurately show. And there are multiple forms of color management, including LUTs, color space transforms, DCTLs, and project settings, and then every camera manufacturer records video a little bit differently, which is why this process can seem to get very complicated very quickly. However, the main focus of this video is to talk about the core principles of how color management works, so you can not only utilize it, but also make your coloring process much simpler and more consistent, no matter where the footage came from or what type of footage you're working with. And just to give you a quick demonstration, if we hop right here into Resolve, when we look at a piece of footage like this, I'm ensuring to have no effects on here, but this log footage is not actually what the camera is really looking at. Now, to describe this in more detail, we're going to talk a little bit about how log works, how gamma curves work, so that you can really understand what's going on in this scenario and why we do transforms to make it appear like this. But first, let's go into this tool over here. We're going to turn to the CIE chromaticity thing. Now, don't worry about all the grid stuff and all of this crazy stuff. I'm actually just going to turn this off to make this easier to see. But let's just expand this window. And to really understand what we're looking at here, let's look at this big outer shape right here, the little curve thing here. This is actually representing what our eyes can physically see. So this is just a representation of all the colors that we can possibly see. And then this inner triangle that we see right here is Rec. 709, and this is what a vast majority of displays are actually physically capable of showing. Now, we're not going to get into the science of how monitors work and delta E values and all of that. That's a topic for another time, but in essence, when we're talking about colors specifically, this is the limitation of how many colors your display can actually show. So let's look at some examples of other cameras here. Let's just go ahead and pull this down and look at different color spaces that cameras capture. So let's just look at Panasonic V Gamut here. You can see that this triangle is much more massive than this triangle here, and it even captures some colors that are outside of the scope of what our eyes see. And if we look at some other ones, like let's just look at another popular one, Sony S-Gamut 3 Cine. That one's a slightly different looking triangle, but also is much more massive than what our monitor can show. And because we have all of these different color spaces, here's reds, which is enormously huge. This is why colors often look like this when they are first put in here, because if we don't tell Resolve or whatever software we're using what kind of footage the camera captured, then it's essentially clamping whatever triangle it sees out here, basically whatever colors it captured, into this small triangle, which is why it looks really flat. So when we tell it exactly what type of colors it shot, we can turn this on, and then now it actually looks much more realistic to what the camera actually captured, but it's clamping the values correctly. And this is also why we tend to put everything into what's known as DaVinci Wide Gamut, if you've ever heard of that. If you aren't working in DaVinci Wide Gamut, you should be. But if we look at DaVinci Wide Gamut, it's also a massive triangle. Now, don't worry about some other triangles being bigger, like Canon and Red have color spaces that might seem out of the scope of DaVinci Wide Gamut, but all in all, these aren't linear scales 1-to-1. This is just a representation of how many total colors it captures, and DaVinci Wide Gamut is typically the best working space for any given camera. But this is what we mean whenever we say going from a camera space, so any one of those other ones that I showed, going into DaVinci Wide Gamut, and then at any given point when we're going to a delivery, we're going from DaVinci Wide Gamut to Rec. 709. And we're going to show this practically, but I wanted to show this visual just so you have a better understanding of what we're actually doing with our colors whenever we use any of those color management tools. So let's go ahead and bring this back down here, and I'm just going to switch this back to the waveform for now. Now you'll notice I didn't talk about log in that example. Now that's because when we're referring to log, what that actually is talking about is our gamma curve, and that's actually more to do with exposure or luminance than it does with color. And this is why terms can get really confusing because some are really similar, but in general, for this video's purposes, we're going to say that log refers to the gamma and a color space refers to the gamut. So gamma means exposure or luminance, and gamut is talking about the color. Now the gamma curve stuff will make sense a little bit later, but just know that the purpose of log is to maximize the total amount of exposure from black to white a camera can capture. But all in all, when it comes to shooting log and wide color gamuts, essentially what you're doing is shooting in a space that you can't actually physically see accurately on a display that can't physically show it. So that's where color management comes in. And of course, we can utilize color management if we turn this back on, and I have these set into groups. If you want to learn more about groups, let me know. We essentially have this going from our camera space into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, which is our working space. We do all of our work inside of there, and at the very end, we go out to our delivery space, which in this instance specifically is Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. Now, an obvious question that comes up whenever you talk about color management is, well, what if I'm shooting Rec 709 or I don't have a log space in general? Can I still use it? And the answer is a resounding yes, absolutely you can. And if I go to a clip here that's actually just straight Rec 709 here, we see that we actually just start from the same space and then end in the same space. Now, this does say Rec 709 Gamma 2.4, so I'll just change this to Rec 709, Rec 709. And you can see here that if we turn these on and off, nothing is happening. But you'll notice, and I'm going to do this in a node before and after this transform here. So this one is inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut. This one is inside of Rec 709. So when we do an adjustment here in Rec 709, you'll see on our waveform that we just kind of flatline when we hit the top when moving our gain. But let's do that same adjustment inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut. If we start increasing our gain, you'll see that we have this nice smooth roll off and it doesn't slam into the ceiling. So we actually have a lot more room to work with because DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate is a significantly more massive space than Rec 709. So no matter what footage you use, you can put it in there. And the other advantage to this is even if it's Rec 709 or you have a bunch of different log footage or even raw footage, is that when we put it all in the same space, that means all of our adjustments are going to behave the exact same no matter what camera type we're working with because we're putting it all in the same working space. Let's just go ahead and reset that. Now, before we get into more of the nitty gritty, let's explain a little something about how lift, gamma, gain, and offset work. And we can better understand these by just going to a grayscale ramp here. And if we look at our waveform here, we'll see that we have this nice straight line indicating that we have black here on the left and white here on the right. Now, to better understand this, we have these numbers 0 to 100. Let's just pretend they're 0 to 1, which 0 meaning black and 1 meaning white. That'll help us illustrate this a little bit better. Now, when it comes to lift, gamma, gain, and offset, you can basically boil them down to just simple mathematical adjustments, where offset is actually simply just an addition adjustment. So you can add or subtract, and it's going to add or subtract the same amount across the entirety of the image. It's just adding and subtracting numbers. When we look at gain, gain is actually a multiplier, which is why it starts at 1, because anything multiplied by 1 is the same number. It doesn't change. But if we look at, let's say right here, for example, again, we'll just call this 0.5. And if we multiply it by 2, then this middle value should end up right here at 1. So let's go ahead and do that. If we put our gain to 2, you'll see that it puts that center point up here to 1. So now this is pure white. And the inverse is true too. If we bring this down to 0.5, we should see 0.5 go down to 0.25. So let's go ahead and do that. And it lands right there at 0.25. Now lift is just the inverse of gain. So lift is also a multiplier, but in the reverse direction. So if we start moving lift, you'll see it moves the exact same way, but in the opposite direction. And the key thing to note about gain is gain will never touch 0, meaning it will never move black. And lift will never move 1 or never move white. Now, gamma is interesting because gamma is actually an exponential adjustment, meaning it'll leave 0 and 1 at the same place, meaning it'll leave black and white at the same. It won't move pure black, pure white, but it'll move everything in between. So if we move gamma, we'll see exactly what that adjustment is doing. This is why people say it functions primarily as a mid-tone adjustment, although I like to think of it a little bit more as a contrast adjustment, whereas if you reduce this, you're increasing contrast. If you increase gamma, you're reducing contrast, generally speaking. Because really at the heart of gamma, it is a contrast adjustment by nature. And we'll get to that in a second. And then, of course, this is a couple other fun things you can play with. You can see how your contrast adjustment works and how your pivot performs. And then when you reverse your contrast, you're actually getting a linear adjustment, whereas if you increase it, you're getting an S-curve. And of course, you can go to your project settings and general options, and you can turn off use S-curve for contrast, and you'll see if I save that, then it's a linear adjustment throughout. So just a fun thing there. I'm going to go ahead and turn it on because I do like S-curves, but that's all to taste. So now that we understand how lift, gamma, gain, and offset function, we can actually understand how temp, tint, saturation, and color boost function, mostly because of gain and gamma, but mostly gain. So if I go to my temp, you'll notice that the temp actually adjusts the highest values the most, and tint will also do the same thing. The highest values get adjusted the most, while 0 is actually not getting moved at all. What adjustment does that? Well, our gain. So our temp and tint are actually just pure gain adjustments for our temp and tint, which is why they appear very unnatural when you use them for white balance adjustments. And funny enough, saturation is the same thing. Saturation is just a gain adjustment on your colors. Now, it's not going to show here because obviously there's no color in the image, but if I go back to that Rec. 709 example and we go to our vector scope here, you'll notice that whatever is farther out is a higher value in color. So if we increase our saturation here, I'm going to go ahead to this node here. So this is your example to see. But if we increase our saturation, you'll notice the highest values are what are going out more. And the values that are low down here aren't going out as much either. And then color boost is like a gamma adjustment for color where you can see those lower values are going up and the higher values aren't increasing as much. But both of these values have one distinct problem, and that is that they're both additive, meaning as you increase them, their colors end up getting brighter, which is an unnatural feeling. We're also going to get to that in a second as well. Now, I brought up those math principles not to be super technical just for the sake of being super technical, but it's actually going to help us really understand these next two core principles, especially the next one. And that is with linear gamma. Now, if you've heard of linear, you probably are familiar with the photometric accurate exposure adjustments or white balance adjustments, and that is true, but let's go into why. And to show this, I'm actually going to switch my timeline to my linear timeline here. And just for reference, this is also an F-log clip going into DaVinci Wide Gamut, and we're outputting to Rec. 709, just plain. We're not doing anything super special here. Now, this timeline just has a bunch of different sample clips of different apertures and different brightness settings on my light. Now, these aren't absolutely perfect examples because I don't have a scientifically engineered room, but this helps display the point. Now, to understand this whole linear gamma thing, we have to take a step back, or a couple steps back really, to understand how a camera is actually capturing light. Now, stay with me for a second because this takes multiple concepts to kind of really bring this in and understand it, but I promise you it'll make a lot of sense and you'll probably geek out about it like I do. Now, when we talk about linear, what we're really referring to is how our eyes see light. We see light in a linear domain or linear space, whatever you want to call it. And linear also in a computer space just refers to gamma 1.0. That is effectively what linear is. And the principle of it means that if you go to Home Depot or something, you're looking at light bulbs, and one of the light bulbs is 400 lumens, and then another light bulb is 800 lumens. Well, the light bulb that's 800 lumens is going to be twice as bright as the bulb with 400 lumens, correct? Well, that's how our eyes will see it, yes. So when a camera captures light, it takes this huge linear domain that we see, it has to clamp it down into this tiny space to be able to fit it into a video space. And then in order for us to see it properly, it has to expand that back out to make it look like what we actually saw. Now, how those curves apply differ from camera to camera, and then of course different displays have different gamma curves to essentially reverse that to show a normal looking image, but essentially that is the process of what's happening. So to describe this visually, let's take a look at this yellow line here that dictates our gamma curve. So we start with what our camera is seeing here in linear, and then the camera takes this data and then applies a video curve to it, and in this case it's a log curve to get as much dynamic range as we can out of the camera, and then we can change that curve while keeping all the data that's there to the curve that our display shows, which can be gamma 2.2, gamma 2.4, etc. But the display part is the tricky part because that's happening behind the scenes, and your monitor has no concept of what's actually being displayed. It just knows it has to compensate for its physical limitations. directions. And there's not really a correct way to show that here because every single monitor is different. But hypothetically speaking, if the monitor did absolutely nothing to what was being displayed on your screen, it would look closer to something like this. So your monitor starts in a linear space and applies a gamma curve in the opposite direction to create that compensation. And that's where gamma 2.4 and all of the others come from. And while this might not be the most important aspect to understand, we now have a much better understanding of how the process goes from camera to display and how we can correctly map into how the camera captured it. Now, how exactly does this help us in Resolve? Well, what really matters here is a concept known as the inverse square law. Well, it's not a concept, it's a law. And without getting too into the nitty-gritty of it, essentially what it means is every time you double the amount of light that you have, that equates to one stop of light. And we can see this if we go back into these clips, and we'll see that every time I double the amount of light that I have, that's an increase of a stop. But how exactly do we utilize this? Well, because we've color managed accordingly, we've gone from camera space into DaVinci Wide Gamut. And so on this node right here, this is living in DaVinci Wide Gamut space. And really all we need to do is tag our gamma to linear. Now, there's one other prerequisite to make this work properly, and that's if we go to our file, project settings, color management, and then if we're not working color managed, which I recommend not working color managed because I prefer working in nodes, but that's besides the point. You want to make sure your timeline color space is DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, because the only way for this node to know how to go into linear and then back out of linear is by this timeline color space right here. So essentially what's happening here is you're doing a color space transform sandwich by just tagging it here, but that project setting will tell it what to go from into linear and then linear back to that thing. But now that we're in linear, how can we get these two to match this first one here? Well, we can go to our gain and bring it down. Now, how exactly does this work? Well, what is gain? Gain is a multiplier. So if we are having our gain, that effectively means we're having the amount of light that we're getting. Same thing if I go to this one, I'm going to half it twice or quarter it. So let's go down to 0.25. And that is why linear gain actually works, because gain is a multiplier, and we're essentially going back into the space that the camera captured light in, and then we're just doing multiplication on the amount of light that we're simulating, taking away or increasing. Now, of course, any color shift that you're seeing is just from either the lens or color shifts from clipping, blah, blah, blah. But you get the point here. And we could do the same thing with all the others. Let's say we want to match these two outer ones to this one. We just take this one down by a stop, which means having our gain so that we take away one stop. And then on this one, we increase it by one stop by doubling the amount of light that we have. And then if we go back and forth through each of them, you can see there's very little difference. And so if we scroll through all of our clips here, you'll see all of them essentially match exposure. So if I go to my waveform here, again, any slight variance you'll see is just from those different color shifts and noise, because this is a very, very bad test. Again, I don't have any scientific tools to do this properly, but the principle is effectively the same. And of course, when I mentioned that gamma is something like a contrast adjustment, well, let's go to this one. And because we're in linear on this one, if we shift our gamma, you'll notice that really what we're getting is just an overall contrast adjustment here. Now, a potentially obvious question here is, can you adjust gamma on middle gray? The answer is it's very, very difficult to. There's not a way to set it to a specific middle gray point. So I wouldn't recommend it if you're trying to preserve middle gray, but it's fun that it's there. Now, of course, because we're in the linear domain still, we can still use our gain to do photometrically accurate white balance adjustments too, assuming you have lume mix set to 0. That is a prerequisite, because otherwise, if you start shifting your colors around with lume mix on, that means that this luminance value is going to be a factor, which you don't want to happen when you are moving your white balance. So just a prerequisite, you want this turned off so that you can move your colors around without affecting your luminance channel. But this will effectively give you a photometrically accurate white balance tint adjustment. And before I see the comments on it, yes, I am very much aware that chromatic adaptation exists. Chromatic adaptation is a very, very great tool, assuming you know what white balance the light source was and what white balance your camera source was. It's a very, very clean tool to be able to adjust your white balance very, very accurately and adjust for a lot of those common shifts. But for the scope of this video, because it's a studio-only tool, I'm not going to focus on it too much, but just wanted to recognize that its existence. Now, the next one I want to talk about are these specific fancy color spaces. So I'm just going to go into my clips bin here, and let's just go to this clip. Actually, let's go to this one just for fun. And I'm going to go back to this. Now, I already have all these nodes built out. This is my custom node tree. But really what I want to focus on are these two nodes right here, these HSV and HSL nodes. Now, these are both tagged on certain color spaces, and these are two of the 4 color spaces that have very unique properties that no other color space does. And the other 2 color spaces outside of HSL and HSV are LAB and YUV. And what I mean by unique properties is that they actually change your red, green, and blue channels to be something that's completely different. And in this case, with HSL and HSV, you have the red channel being our hue, our green channel being the saturation, and the blue channel being either luminance or value, depending on if it's HSL or HSV. Now I'm going to focus on these 2, but I just want to show the other 2 as well, just so you understand what they do. With LAB, your red channel becomes your luminance channel, your green becomes the A channel or the green-red axis, and your blue channel becomes your B or your blue and yellow axis channel. And this can have some fun effects, like if you disable your first channel inside of LAB, and then you move your gain up and down, you can have some interesting split toning effects if you play this against linear gain. So just a fun thing with LAB. I'll make sure channel 1's turned back on. Now YUV is very similar, where the red channel turns into Y or the luminance channel. And then your green channel becomes your U, which is the blue chrominance. And then your blue channel becomes the V, which is your red chrominance. So those 2 color spaces are ones you can play around with if you feel like it. But let's go ahead and talk about what we really want to discuss, which is HSL and HSV. Now, when I first showed you the example, you'll notice that there was a saturation channel on both of these, and that is on our green channel. Now, what a lot of people do is they'll disable the first and third channels so that when they move this whole gain bar, it only operates on the saturation channel, but I usually just operate on the green channel. There's no difference with how it operates. It's just something I prefer to do. But of course, if you have a control surface, that might be desirable. But anyways, aside from that, what's the difference between the saturations in HSV and HSL? Well, if you remember what we mentioned briefly earlier about the saturation and color boost models and the primaries being additive because colors got brighter as you made them more saturated, that's similar to what HSL does. HSL is actually a very, very similar model to the saturation in the primaries. So if we increase saturation here, you'll notice it looks very similar as if we increase saturation in a different spot. So very, very similar, but you'll notice with HSV, if we increase saturation, it's definitely giving us a different response, and that's because HSV is subtractive in its saturation, meaning when we increase the saturation of our colors, the colors get darker. And that mimics how things get more saturated and colorful in the real world. When light bounces off of something that's more colorful, there's less light coming back, meaning you'll see less of it and it'll be darker. This is also how film and print work. When you start with a white point, you add cyan, magenta, yellow, and some black sometimes to get a certain color, and the more you add to it, the darker it gets because the less light reflects off of it. And so that's how you can get saturation and density type of looks from film and print. So we use the HSV model to kind of emulate that inside of Resolve. Now, of course, the side effect with having HSV is if you subtract saturation, your colors will actually get brighter. So if you kind of do the inverse of both of them in a way-ish, I don't know if that's the correct term, but if you take away saturation in HSL, that's an additive model, and then you add saturation back in HSV around the same amount roughly, and then you do a before and after just by highlighting both and then doing before and after, you notice our saturation doesn't really change much, but our density does. So this is a form of a density adjustment because we're subtracting in both directions in terms of luminance. Now you'll notice I do have this set in a parallel node, and that's because if you put them in line, so as an example, if I took out HSL and put it after HSV, you'll notice it gives us a very different looking image, and it doesn't quite do the same thing as if it was parallel in line with each other. But another interesting thing you can do is not only can you adjust it in your gain, but you can also adjust saturation in gamma. So maybe you want to take away some saturation in your gain, but then, oh, I should probably reset this too, so it's more accurate. So I can take it away in gain, so I can take away the highest valued saturations, but I can then push it in gamma, so I can fill in the colors in the lower to mid tones. And if we look at our vector scope to kind of see what's happening here, I'll make this bigger. So I'll just do a little before and after here. You'll see, actually, I'll go ahead and just reset both of those so we can watch this in real time. So let's go ahead and take away our gain. You'll see that the higher values are going down more. And then when I push the gamma, you'll see that we can push it back up to roughly where it was. And if I do a before and after here, you'll see that a lot of these values down below are starting to push up, and the highest saturations are pushing down. You'll see that practically in the image. A lot of these green areas that have a lot of saturation, they're coming down slightly, whereas a lot of these desaturated areas still maintain their color. If we do a more drastic version of this, let's just go ahead and take this way down and push this way up. Now you'll see a bigger difference here. So this is a good way to compress colors and make those really, really heavy colors that are harder to control, reel them back in, and still push a decent amount of color through your whole image. Now there's one caution with using an HSV or HSL model. If you go back to the math on how the lift, gamma, gain, and an offset all worked, you'll notice that there's something that gain and gamma don't move that both lift and offset do move, which is 0 or black. And a saturation value of 0 can't add color because there's no color to begin with. So if you move saturation and lift, you'll notice that the image kind of breaks very quickly. Also, and the same with offset, because offset's moving 0. So it might not be immediately noticeable in certain areas, but if we go to a different image, as an example, let's just go back to the linear ones, and let's just add an HSV node here. So let's say I push lift here. You'll notice that we're getting a lot of breakage in areas that weren't really supposed to have color. Colors are splitting apart. So again, generally not recommended, meaning don't. And that's why knowing how a lot of these tools work can really help you with your whole color management pipeline, because then it opens you up to a lot of functionality and tool sets that you didn't have before that make your job a lot easier. Now, speaking of pipelines, I did mention near the beginning that there are more ways to manage your media outside of just the color space transforms. Now, color space transforms are an amazing tool, and I still use them to bring them into my DaVinci Wide Gamut space, but I do want to showcase something. Now, this is a studio-only feature, so I tend to stay away from talking about those, but I do want to mention it here because it is very much worth mentioning. I'm going to go ahead and go to my multi here. And let's say instead of the CST we have for our DRT, which DRT just means display rendering transform. It's just a general way of saying I'm transforming this into a different space. Instead of this color space transform, I'm actually going to bring in a DCTL. And I'm going to show you two different ones here. They're both free. You can find them online. I can give the link in the description as well. But the first one I'll show is the JP2499 DRT. And this one already has DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate and then DaVinci Wide Gamut Linear built into it. But essentially, this will allow us to output Rec 709 Gamma 24 or any other common delivery space that we might use. And the nice thing about this is it already kind of has a defined look. So a CST, when you output to Rec 709, will usually just hit red, green, and blue channels very linearly. JP2499 doesn't really do that. It actually adds a slightly defined look where it adds a little bit of inherent color separation. Like, for example, in the red channel, the shadows will shift more towards magenta, whereas the highlights will shift more towards yellow. Same thing in green, it'll shift more towards yellow in the shadows, more towards cyan in the highlights, and same thing with blue. And what this does is it allows us to get a little bit of a more defined look right off the bat, as opposed to just using a regular CST. And we also have control over our overall hue rotations in every channel, as well as in the highlights specifically too, as well as the purity, which is basically just a saturation adjustment. And then we have OpenDRT, and there's two versions of this. There's OpenDRT here, which essentially allows you to have specific look presets if you wanted to add those, which can be really nice to just give a really specific look, but not as much control over those looks themselves unless you use OpenDRT stick shift, in which case you get all of these controls, which can be very overwhelming, but extremely useful if you're trying to define a very specific look that you need to carry through all of your footage. But I just wanted to showcase those because there are more than just CSTs to use. I personally usually use the JP2499, although I have been seeing some really fun results with OpenDRT as well. But again, like I said, I still use a color space transform for my what's called an IDT. So there's an IDT and ODT. Those are just two different things to distinguish from an input display transform and output display transform. So it probably will feel a little bit overwhelming to incorporate all of these things into your color grading practice, but of course, ease into it and see what works for you. But what are some of the other advantages you get out of these things outside of just photometric accuracy or getting a really quick look and having different ways of doing things? Well, one thing that this really helps with in particular that I'm going to showcase here would be camera matching. I'm going to go ahead and enable my clips here, and we're going to look at these three right here. Now, all three of these were shot on completely different cameras. This was shot on a Fuji, this was shot on a Sony, and this was shot on a Panasonic. And this one didn't even have the ability to shoot log. But what's nice is I can go in and let's say I define my look here. Let's make sure I have the right DRT. I'm just going to use this. I'll crank my density all the way up. Why not? But I'll just go ahead and check the waveform. It's actually pretty decently exposed. I'll just bring it down a little bit, and I'm just going to go ahead and define a quick look. So I'm just going to add this here because I want this contrast adjustment to be uniform across all cameras. And because we've color managed all of our cameras in the same way, the middle gray point is consistent among all our clips. So I can go ahead and go into my gallery here. I have this saved as a power grade, but I can just add this little pin here on my curve, and this is the pin point for middle gray for DaVinci Intermediate. You can also set your pivot on your contrast in the primaries to 0.336, and that's the middle gray point for DaVinci Intermediate as well. So if you adjust contrast from here, it won't change the exposure. But same thing with this pinpoint here. If I adjust contrast in any sort of way here, it's not going to change the exposure if I don't move this point. So I can define a nice little contrast look, and I don't have to worry about it changing exposure in any of the cameras that I have in this timeline. So I'll just add a quick little adjustment here. I'm not going to do anything super crazy with it. And so let's just go ahead and go to our balance. I'm also going to show off this really nice tool here from Pixel Tools. This is called the Checkers Basic. And this will allow me to see my skin tones and see where they're at and see if they're balanced. And we have to tell it which transfer function we're using. So this is really good for setting right before your output transform. I can also turn on the split view to see the original clip if I want to see how I am adjusting this. I'm going to turn on clips here. So I'm just going to go to my balance node, which is set to linear balance. And I'm just going to move this and see if I can get my skin tones in a better spot while also still seeing them and making sure it's actually looking the way it should. I do want this to lean a little more warm, so I can do this. And, changes are somewhat subtle, but at least my skin tones are more accurate in this instance. So let's go ahead and turn that off now, because now we have our baseline for what we want to match to. So now if we go to the Sony clip, I'm going to go ahead and turn on my split clip here and make sure selected clips is selected. So that way I can control click this Fuji. And now I can see an overlay on my vector scope and side by side on the waveforms to make sure my exposure is matching. So by default, it was this. I had already done a little bit beforehand, but I'm just going to go ahead and bring this down to somewhat match the exposure, which is probably right around here. And then I want to go to my balance and go to my vector scope. And then we'll notice exactly what our issue is pretty quickly, where if we start balancing the skin tone here, because I'm mainly trying to balance for skin tone. You'll notice that this wall in the background is definitely skewed in a weird direction, even though we got our skin tones close. So what other tools can we utilize for this? Well, my favorite tool for camera matching, and this also helps when we're in the consistent space, these tools are going to behave the same exact way every time, but I use a Tetra tool. And Tetra basically just means it's taking all 6 color vectors, so red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta, and I'm able to shift them along the red, cyan, green, magenta, or yellow, blue axis. So for example, if I took that yellow and I wanted to shift it towards red or cyan, I just move it like so, and you can see where it's moving. Same thing with yellow green. If I move this, it's move green magenta. And same thing with yellow blue. If I move it along this, it'll move it towards the yellow and blue axis. So what I can do with this is I notice it's got to shift a little bit towards magenta a bit. So I need to subtract yellow green and move it up here. And maybe I need to take away some of that yellow because it is kind of strong on there, and just make it a little bit more in line. And somewhat of this is feeling it by eye too. So push it down a little more towards cyan. And just like that, we have a lot better matching on that wall, and the hair isn't as yellow. So now we have a much better match. Now I could do a little bit more to get some of the reds intact, but this is just a quick once over example. But let's say you didn't have, again, this is a DCTL, it's studio only. So what other options do we have? Well, let's go ahead and reset this. You can actually utilize the RGB mixer. In an RGB mixer, we can do a somewhat similar thing, albeit it's definitely harder to control, but let's go ahead and bind all of our outputs to auto. And essentially what this is doing is it's changing the amount of red, green, and blue that's going into each respective output. If you want me to do a more detailed breakdown on the RGB mixer and fully how it works, let me know. But essentially with all of these bound to auto, it's going to keep our luminance the same and the amount that's going into each of them the same. So I can go ahead and drag my blue output up and down, and that's going to do a similar thing where it's going to pull the overall balance of the image towards blue. If I bring it down, if I bring it up, it's going to push it towards yellow. And similar thing, if I move the green, it's going to move along the green magenta axis. And then if I move the red, it's going to move along the red cyan axis. So we can do a somewhat similar thing that we just did a moment ago, and that's also a much better match right away. So you can kind of look at it and feel where it's supposed to go. And then of course we have the Panasonic as well, where we might definitely need to do a lot more work, but it's kind of the same concept where we compare it to our master shot here, see if we need to change exposure at all, and maybe the contrast is a little off. So I might even just push gamma in here to get some of that contrast back up or down, but I'm not going to do that in this case. So I'm just going to make sure exposure is in a relatively decent spot here. And then we can match our balance with our vector scope, moving it along here and make sure it's matched. And then if we need to do any extra Tetra or RGB mixer stuff, we can. But I think we get the idea. I can go ahead and go in here and maybe raise those shadows a little bit just so it's not quite as low to the floor, because some of those blacks are definitely way too low. So we can go ahead and bring those up and keep our curves down. And that's the way we can kind of soften the image and remove some of that little Rec 709-y look that it shot in. But this is how useful color management can be, because you can have the same exact adjustments on completely different cameras and they'll behave the same way. Of course, you still may need to correct for some camera biases or lens bias. That always happens, but you now have a much better way of handling that, and you have a much better understanding of how color management works, how your pipeline works, and how you can best utilize whatever type of footage you have in any given situation, whether it's correcting problem footage or developing a specific look or just being able to work faster. I really hope this video on color management really helped you do at least one of those things, or maybe all three of them, who knows. But let me know if this tutorial was helpful for you, and if there's anything you didn't understand, please leave a comment and I'll be happy to explain or go into further detail on, and let me know what you thought of all the great and beautiful, wonderful things. If you want to see some more content about literally anything, I wonder what that video is. You can probably click on it. I also have some more of DaVinci Resolve content on Kevin Stratford's channel if you want to learn some more about fusion or green screening, or how to fix DaVinci Resolve lag. You have options. But this is Camera Tim signing out. In Soviet Russia, Color manages you. Never again.